Are we in a second Cold War? And are we this generation's Soviet Union? There's been a lot of conversation about the US entering a second Cold War with the China-Russia axis. And it seems like it's the same players once again, and you're going to have the same ideological tensions and the same outcome. However, Niall Ferguson provides an interesting counterfactual that I'm going to react to in this video. What if America is the Soviet Union in the second Cold War? In his piece, We're All Soviets Now, he presents that argument. And in this episode of Analyzing Finance with Nick, I'm going to see whether his claims on the U.S. economy currently versus the Soviet Union's economy in the 70s and the 80s actually hold water. Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. This is the first time I'm going to be reacting to a written piece of commentary versus another YouTube video. But I think Niall Ferguson is one of the more interesting intellectuals out there, and I've been following his work really since I was in high school when I first read Colossus and Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World. I also recommend his book, The Ascent of Money, because it's a good history of how most modern financial products were invented and how abusive these led to the financial crisis. And he's written some other interesting books since about the life of Kissinger, and also about a book called Civilization in 2011. And also a biography about the Rothschild family called The House of Rothschild, which is like the most comprehensive source that I've found about their story. But on to the point of this article, the argument, and it's by the subheadline, just explains it simply. A government with a permanent deficit and bloated military, a bogus ideology pushed by elites, poor health among the ordinary people, and senile leadership. Sound familiar? That can both describe the Soviets in the 70s and the 80s, and it could also describe America in the 2020s on a superficial level. And before I get into the article itself, one key thing which I think he is getting at a point is we have elites that are stuck in an ideology that does not work and ignores just basic fundamental gravity of society. The Soviet Union ignored economic gravity. They thought they could centrally plan the economy and create a better outcome than a free market, and they failed at that badly, which led to shortages across all of the consumer sectors of the economy and many other sectors of the Soviet economy. And America, instead of being in denial about basic laws of economics, the US tends to be in denial of basic laws of sociology. There are many beliefs that our Ivy League elite class believe in that kind of violate centuries, if not millennia, of basic common sense in terms of social cohesion and human interaction that they're simply in denial of just because of their ideology that with enough education or enough coercion that you can force people to have different beliefs that are in contradiction of human nature. But with that out of the way, let's move on to the core argument that Niall has. The first one he has is about life expectancy and about how, in healthcare, about how the Soviet Union and its end had a major problem with declining health expectations and results, and that the US is at risk of replicating those if they have not already. Infant mortality is the first example he cites, where he says that infant mortality in the Soviet Union was around 25 per 1,000, and that figure in the US, by comparison, is only about 5.4. And Niall disingenuously, which I disagree with him on this point, makes the argument that for single mothers in the poorest parts of the country, it's 13 per 1,000. But what if we did that for single mothers in the poorest parts of the Soviet Union back then? It's probably a lot worse too. So I think that's a cheap shot. The other thing is that the US's infant mortality statistics skew higher than other parts of the world because the US tries to save a lot of premature babies that other countries would just identify as a miscarriage and write off. So the fact that we are saving a lot of lives that otherwise would have not been able to come due to taking care of and using advanced medical technology to keep or at least attempt to, and oftentimes successfully, keep premature babies alive should not be taken to be used against the U.S. on this statistic. Other thing, though, however, he does have a stronger point on is productivity. Given the advancements of technology such as AI, you figured we would have massive growth in productivity. However, since 2007, and I mentioned this in my video about the declining quality of human capital, U.S. non-farm business productivity has been stagnant. It's stuck at 1.5%. If you look at productivity per worker, it's been trending downward, and since the 2007, whereas it grew consistently before that. And the statistics are similar to how the Soviets in the 70s and the 80s. They had a joke there. You pretend to pay people in exchange that they pretend to work. And I think we've seen a lot of that with Gen Z work culture, such as quiet quitting and a lot of jobs that really don't create any value, the BS jobs phenomenon, which I've mentioned several times on this channel. And you basically have a society also where it's easier than ever just to get by, whether it's through parental support or more generous social welfare programs or being able to easy access to credit until fairly recently. Whereas it's very difficult, and coming due to housing prices and higher education costs and a globally competitive labor force, to make it into the thriving level, which is what a lot of millennials and Gen Zs grew up with their parents. And to replicate the standard of living of their parents is much harder today. Only about half of millennials have incomes adjusted for inflation higher than their parents did at the same age. And that's kind of the similar idea that, like, when the social contract breaks and people feel like working hard doesn't pay enough, productivity goes down and people slack and prioritize work-life balance or quiet quitting or whatever. And the Soviet Union is the most extreme example of this, because no matter how hard you worked, you still always got the same, because the basics of Marxism was from each their ability to each their need, and that applied to everybody except for the political elites in that society. And so unless if you were in the political elite of that society, your hard work didn't pay off at all. In the US, it's not nearly as bad. Hard work still pays off. And if you want me to do a whole video about the changing correlations of hard work and success, I can do that. But it doesn't seem to pay off as clearly as it did in previous generations. So I think I give Neil in this one a partial agreement. The next one he talks about is the budget, particularly defense spending relative to deficits. It's called the Niall Ferguson indicator, and he has a chart about this where he goes into whenever a great power in history has had their interest payment on the debt exceed military spending or defense spending, that's usually the game over. And in 2024, we have hit that point with interest rates going from 0 to 5, increasing the interest expense given how relatively low duration the treasuries are in terms of bonds outstanding. It's less than 7 years, so those interest rates catch up quickly. And due to rates being high, the government's not really replacing its long duration bonds. Probably the biggest mistake that the previous secretaries of Treasury have all committed over the last 15 years was not backloading bond issuance, especially when rates were 0. You could have locked in for 30 years 2 to 3% interest rates for the government, and instead they just issued in the short term because that was 0 and it looks better for public finances and had cheaper interest expense now, at least now back then. So now when it's time that option to refinance on the back end of the curve is no longer there. You have to pay 4+, and you lock, so they're all, and then the front end is 5. And so either way, you're now paying much higher interest, and it's for the first time in American history, interest expense on the debt has exceeded military budget. And Soviet Union and Spain and Portugal and France all exceeded these amounts. It really ultimately spelled the end of military dominance. Is that going to be the case with the U.S.? Possibly, but we really won't know until the next major conflict, until that's exposed. There's a lot of social and cultural resemblances too. First, the average age of politicians. In the U.S., even though we have a relatively younger population than the rest of the developed nations, whether it's the EU, East Asia, or Australia, New Zealand, or Canada, we have much older leadership. I remember in 2004, the average Congress person was 45 years old, and in 2019 it's 59, and now it's over 60. So it's basically the same boomers are not giving up power. even it might be turning over between them. You look at our presidential election, it's a 77-year-old versus an 81-year-old. And prior to this, Reagan's second term, he quit at 77, and he was the previous oldest president. So we have, and it's not just the president, like the leaders of the Senate, a lot of our Supreme Court justices, and a lot of the senior Congress people as well, the House, are all well into their 70s, if not their 80s. And it's a sign of, you have senile leadership is a sign of a society possibly in decline. In the Soviet Union, Brezhnev, Andropov were all very old. And by the time Gorbachev took power, it was kind of already, the writing was on. The counter argument to this whole aging a society is that Americans at those ages are a lot healthier than Soviet people were at those ages in the 20th century due to increased medical technology and greater priority of exercise. That is a valid counterargument, but doesn't. There's been plenty of evidence, though, of senility across the aisle in terms of political leadership. And so there is, I think, still a hard limit. Would any major publicly traded company hire a 78-year-old or an 81-year-old to be its CEO? No. Why would we do that for president? I mean, not just because like that experience is bad necessarily, but there are limitations just physically to having such a high-stress job, such as the president of the United States, at such an age. If you look at a lot of Gallup surveys, that people generally distrust most of major institutions, whether it's the Supreme Court, banks, public schools, the presidency, big tech, unions, all have less than 27% support. For big business in general, news media, Congress, it's below 20%. For the House specifically, it's 8%. You could also look at mainline Protestant churches, basically collapsed in attendance, and those were a previously dominant institution. The university has started to lose its credibility as well among society. Just look at the reactions to the video that I did about should people go to college and the enrollment cliff that is coming for a lot of universities. And it's beyond just demographics. A lot of people just don't see the value in it. So it's institutions just all around have been losing trust. And that's the same thing that happened in the late Soviet period, because people didn't trust their institutions either because of the hypocrisy of those running them and the fact that they were co-opted to push an ideology that most of the population didn't really believe in or thought was bankrupt and ineffective. So that is something also that they have in common. And there's been just a value shift that especially among younger generations, that has concerned me too. Wall Street Journal and Pew have done research on this, and they show that a lot of things that Americans traditionally value are not as important anymore. And I might go into this in a future video, which I'd call Gen Z is the most materialistic generation. But and I'm going to show the chart here too. But in this data, it shows that things such as patriotism, religious faith, having kids, family in general, community involvement, spirituality, etc., have all declined. The only thing that people valued that has become more important in the last 4 years has been money. I'll go into why on this in a future video, because the fact that Americans are not prioritizing deeper goals or deeper fulfillment and instead prioritizing cold hard cash is a sign of a society that could be declining in the spiritual sense and could be just giving up its will to live in the metaphorical sense. And we're not seeing that just figuratively, but we're seeing that literally too with the deaths of despair statistics that Niall Ferguson goes into here, which are very similar eerily to the Soviet Union. The US is the only developed country where life expectancy is declining. And that is mostly due to the abuse of prescription drugs and opioids and increased fentanyl use and overdoses. Apparently, the amount of Americans who died from fentanyl overdoses is more than they're killed in the Vietnam War, which is kind of crazy to really think about. And deaths of despair, which is due to drugs and alcohol, are responsible for more than 1.3 million deaths from people ages 25 to 64, 1990 to 2017. And suicide rates have gone up, heart disease issues have gone up, and diabetes. Some of this could be fixed with Ozempic, so that's a plus. And Niall Ferguson acknowledges that in this, but he says that the fact that we just want to just use throwing money and drugs to solve problems that are likely caused by psychological and social issues is not a good thing. And also just the high spike in mental health issues, like 25% of Gen Zers claiming to have some sort of mental illness, and the increased prescription of antidepressants, I think, compounded this problem. And the way it compares to is what happened in the Soviet Union towards the end of its reign, and then Russia after it fell, was the increased spike in alcohol abuse, which caused Russian life expectancy, especially for men, to drop by almost a decade in the 80s and the 90s. And this is something, there is a commonality. Again, with these examples, I think that Niall Ferguson is using hyperbole to warn American readers that they could potentially go toward this direction, because all the examples in the Soviet Union, whether it's the denial of reality, whether it's the deaths of despair problem, whether it's people's loss in belief in anything above just short-term material needs, it was always much worse in Soviet Russia than in America. So, like, the trends are similar, but the magnitude is way different. And that's where I think Neil might be off on this. The other thing he wants to talk about really is the denial of ideological perspective of a lot of basic things that people, again, assume that are just the standard way of human relationships, and how there's a big gap between those who say went to an Ivy League school, have more than 150,000 annually, and live in a zip code of more than 10,000 people per square mile, tend to have these elitist luxury beliefs, while everybody else tends to have the opposite beliefs, and it's creating a major disconnect. And this was similar to the people who worked for the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and your typical citizen. This divide is also why a lot of the people don't trust leadership, and also why the leadership can't really fix the problems, because they're ideologically bound to beliefs that don't make any sense. Like, example would be if they did polls on who would pay $500 more in taxes and higher costs for gas and electricity to fight climate change. 75% of Ivy Leaguers said they would do it, versus only 25% of the general population. Another one would say that teachers should decide what's taught in school opposed to parents, where 71% of Ivy Leaguers agree with that, whereas only 35% of the general public agrees with that. Do you think the U.S. provides too much individual freedom? 50% of Ivy Leaguers said yes, whereas only 15% of average Americans did. This is a major fundamental disconnect between the elite leadership and the established elite, which, if you want to know more about the hierarchies of how American social class works, check out my video on it, because it's not as straightforward as simply the elite and everybody else. The elite of two branches, people who are connected to the current establishment and those who've created their own path. And people who are on the establishment ladder have the exact opposite beliefs. Dr. Ferguson did a good job pointing this out, than normal people do. So overall, is the U.S. becoming the next Soviet Union? And will we be the ones, due to a stagnant society with a disconnected leadership, ultimately fall and be replaced by a China-led world order? I think, again, there are some signs of the rot, but it's a lot further along. Like, if we are going to go down the Soviet path, we've probably got a good 30 years at least before things fall apart. And the society does have the freedom to turn things around. And I'm more optimistic. In the age of the internet, people are aware of blatant hypocrisies. Like, before Glasnost, if Niall Ferguson wrote about this in the 1970s during the Soviet Union, he'd be thrown in a gulag and it would have never been published. I mean, just again, do the internet and free speech, and people seeing a lot of how a late stage elite behaves, and it's just in general, not necessarily everybody, because a lot of people are distracted by sports and their jobs and their individual life, but enough the intellectual class or concerned citizens that can see what's going on, the awareness helps give more power to change it. And also, there's not really somebody to step up. Like, who's like the successful free society that would replace the U.S.? I mean, barring a change of leadership, I don't see that power in the foreseeable future. So that thing, it's like the European Union is arguably worse than the U.S. in a lot of these statistics, except for the average age of the politicians. They're further down the aisle. Same with Japan and China. Their economic and political model may be in jeopardy too. So it could be a sovereign individual type situation where really the idea of the state entirely goes obsolete. But again, that's probably at least another 30 years away. So I disagree with the fact that the US is ultimately going to fall apart and become the Soviet Union. But I think that he is seeing the early signs of what could be a terminal illness, and if they're not turned around quickly, could lead to a similar style decline. If you have any questions or disagreements or comments, I would love to continue the discussion here.